Aren't there times when it's appropriate and even righteous to be angry? Aren't there times when human anger can produce good? So that's the question I want to deal with today. The emotion of anger is not in itself inherently sinful. So if you're doing some work with a hammer and you whack your thumb with that hammer, I guarantee you're going to be angry. If you're driving down 45 and somebody cuts you off and runs you off the road, you end up in a ditch, you're going to be angry about that, and probably justly so. If you go to work and find out that people have been talking about you and saying untrue things, if you come home and find out that one of your kids has been bullied by a bigger kid, these things make you angry, and there's nothing wrong with feeling angry about any of those things. You can't really control how you feel. But what you can control and what's important is, what do you do with that emotion you feel? What do you do with that anger? So one of the things we see in the scriptures is sometimes God gets angry. God the Father is often shown as angry in the Old Testament. Jesus the Son in the New Testament, we see him get angry a handful of times. What does that mean for us? I want to give you 3 examples of the anger of God in the scriptures. I just want you to know these are not the 3 points of the sermon, okay? So don't get excited when we get to number 3 and think, oh man, we're out of here early. No, don't want you to get angry at me for that, okay? If you do get angry, just be warned, I run pretty fast. So Psalm 7 verse 11 says, God is a righteous judge and a God who feels indignation every day. So you take that out of context and it makes it sound like God is this smoldering volcano that can just go off at any time. That he's very scary, he's very volatile. And in fact, we see in the scriptures times when God his anger does come forth and punishes human beings. It punishes the people of Israel for chasing after false gods. It punishes the other nations for inflicting pain on Israel. It punishes individual people for doing evil things. And yet we also see in Exodus 34, 6 through 7, this great story where Moses is talking to God and God is communicating with Moses face to face. And Moses, you can just see his mind thinking, I may never have this chance again, so I'm just going to ask it now. Lord, show me your glory. Lord, just show me all of you. That's what I want more than anything else. And God hides him in a cleft of the rock. And he covers him with his hand. He says, you can't see my face, but you'll see my back. And the interesting thing about that story is Moses never sees anything. Instead, he hears the following words as God tells him, this is who I really am. Okay, so Exodus 34, 6 through 7, God says, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the 3rd and the 4th generation. So his leading characteristics are merciful, gracious, slow to anger, quick to forgive, abounding in love. So he's not a smoldering volcano. He's not a box of TNT with a short fuse. But he does have anger, and he feels it every day. Why? Because God's anger, the theologians will tell you, is not like our anger. It's not like what happens when we hit our thumb with a hammer or when somebody calls us a name and we just react. God's anger is not volatile. It is not emotional. It is, according to theologians, it is his settled opposition to evil. So God's never lost it in his life. He's never blown his stack. He's never gotten to the point where he says, wow, I really lost my temper there. No, instead, every time there's evil in the world, he is opposed to it. And his opposition results in wrath, which results in real world consequences. That is his anger. So in other words, when it says that God is a God in Psalm 7 verse 11, that God is righteous and he feels indignation every day, it's not about God being an angry God, it's about this world being an evil world. Because there's a lot of evil that God has to oppose. Now the second example is in Mark chapter 3 verse 5. So the story of Mark 3 is that Jesus is visiting one of the synagogues in one of the towns of Galilee, his home region, and he sees a man there who has a crippled hand. In the ancient world, it wasn't like here where we make allowances, we make adjustments so that someone who is born without the ability to use their hands or their feet or to see or to hear, or maybe experiences some illness or injury that causes them to be physically disabled, we make allowances so that they can still live a full life, they can still get a job, they can still live out the purpose that God created them for. But in the ancient world, none of that existed. So this man, however he lost the use of his hand, that meant that was the end of his life of usefulness as we measure it. And Jesus saw this, and he saw all of it. When he saw this man in the synagogue, he knew this guy needs help, and I have the power to help him. He also knew a second thing. He knew that the people in that room, the people in that synagogue, were under the teaching of the scribes and Pharisees of the day that had taken the law of God that was righteous, and they had added to it more specific commandments, because that's what legalism does. It says, well, the Bible's not enough. We need to create our own little rules that say, if you do this, you're out of the club, okay? Well, one of their rules that they had invented was you can't render medical aid to someone on the Sabbath day, because that in their mind is working. Jesus knew, if I heal this guy, they're going to be angry. They'll be angry with me, but then after I leave, they'll be angry at him. So I need to confront them about their wrong theology and their anger before I do any miracle. And so what he does is he says to the people of the synagogue, he says, hey, everybody, I have a question for you. Is it better on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil? Is it better to save a life or to kill? And the scribes and the Pharisees who were there, the rabbi and whoever else, they knew he had them. They knew he was right. They knew if we answer, we're either going to have to lie or we're going to have to admit that he's right, and we won't do either one, because that's how stubborn they were. So they kept silent. And this was Jesus' response, Mark 3:5. And he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. So we see two things about Jesus' anger. Number one, it comes from sorrow, not from an insult, not from a wounded pride or a bruised ego, like so much of our anger does. It came from sorrow over their sin, over the fact that they would rather hold on to their unbiblical commandments and rules than see one of their own get restored to full life. It was sorrow for this man who had to live in that kind of legalistic environment. It was anger born of sorrow. And second thing we see is the result of his anger, Jesus got so mad he healed somebody. How about that? He got so angry. No, he didn't cuss somebody out. He didn't throw a fit. He didn't break some windows. He didn't turn some guy into a chicken. Probably deserved it, but he didn't do that. He got so mad he healed somebody. That was the result of his anger. That's how you know it was righteous anger. There's a third example. This is the most famous example of any in the scriptures. And that's in Matthew 21, when Jesus goes the week of Passover, the last Passover of his earthly life, when Jesus goes into the temple in Jerusalem. And he walks in to the court of the Gentiles, and he sees this massive marketplace that is opened up, these people who are exchanging currency, people who are selling doves and sheep and goats, and he starts flipping tables, and he turns, he grabs a whip, he grabs some cords, he braids them together and turns them into a whip, and he goes around just thrashing people. Jesus chooses violence. It's the only time we know of that Jesus ever became physically violent. And he drove, listen, this is how violent Jesus was on that day, how angry he was. The court of the Gentiles, the area we're talking about, it's bigger than our sanctuary and the atrium put together. It's bigger than that. I've been there. Jesus cleared the whole place. So think about, you're a merchant, that's your living, and you leave your stuff behind to get out of there because you're so scared of this guy. Jesus was angry. And his disciples had never seen anything like this. They didn't know he had it in him. And so he had to give them an explanation. And here's his explanation in Matthew 21, 13 through 14. He said to them, it is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you make it a den of robbers. And the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. So here's what I hear often, especially from men, but even sometimes from some women. Well, I know I'm not supposed to be angry, but Jesus flipped tables. I know that seems that I know you think I'm rude. I know you think I'm uncaring. You know, I make people angry and I hurt people's feelings. But Jesus flipped tables, man. He ran those people out. So, you know, I'm okay, right? So two things. First of all, and I say this as an absolute authority, okay? You're not Jesus. Number two, it's important in situations like this. When God, the Father or God the Son, when they do something that is unusual, they don't usually act this way. Ask yourself, okay, Why was he so angry? Who was he angry at? Let me answer those two questions for you. For the second one first. He wasn't angry at people who were outsiders. He wasn't angry at people who committed terrible sins and offended his sense of moral indignation. He wasn't angry at people who called him names. There's so many examples in the Gospels of people calling Jesus names, lying about him, falsely accusing him. He never gets angry about any of that. He's angry at the scribes and the Pharisees. He's angry at the religious leaders of his people, the most morally devout and religiously conspicuous people in his culture. He's angry with them. Why? Because these people have set up a system inside the temple that makes them wealthy at the expense of leading people to salvation. And I know this is a fact because the verse he quotes when he says, "My house shall be a house of prayer." Everyone in the room, everyone who heard him knew what he was quoting. He was quoting Isaiah 56. Because back in those days, they knew the Bible better than you and I. They could finish the sentence for him. "My house shall be a house of prayer for all nations." Go look it up. You can do it right now if you want to. It won't offend me a bit. Isaiah 56 is about the Lord's desire, God's desire to bring all nations into his family. Not just Jews, but Gentiles too. As someone without a drop of Jewish blood, I'm so thankful that God's desire, that Jesus' desire was to bring Gentiles into the family. And Jesus, when he showed up in the court of the Gentiles, the one area of the temple, in fact, the one place on earth where someone like me could go and be in the presence of God Almighty and be saved, was full of commerce. That's what made him angry. So, again, notice the result. Notice why he's angry on behalf of others. He's angry on behalf of righteousness. And notice the result. What's the result? Well, it says next that the lame and the blind came to him and he healed them. Because he got angry, salvation occurred.